welcome to Digging Deeper. Today we've got Chelsea back with us in the studio. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thanks again for having me, Al.
It's been 4 weeks since we've heard from you. What's been happening, Chels?
Oh, yeah, time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? A lot of work. It's been very busy, which is usually quite typical of this time of year.
What are your peak months? Is it now and like an autumn calving and a spring calving type time?
Yeah. So around calving times, things do get very busy, particularly around late calving for us. But yeah, we do seem to go through these months, particularly around sort of April and September, where the end of calving season often is when you start to get problems with calvings themselves and lambings and things like that. So
why is that?
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if it's more the over fat ones that are more likely to go past their due date and maybe have bigger calves and lambs inside them, so they're more likely to just have problems.
What about, are we getting tired of calving and lambing? We're not checking them as much, or being diligent?
I do think that does play a bit of a role. People are just getting a bit fatigued themselves, and there does seem to be this bit of a syndrome of that last handful of animals. You talk to any farmer and they'll say, it's always the last handful that give you grief. So it overlaps with us disbudding the dairy calves, and we're still preg testing a lot of the spring calves as well. And because people are starting to get organised for joining, it means we need to go out and check the bulls before joining as well. So all the work just overlaps at once, and then calving finishes and the spring preg testing finishes and the bull testing finishes, and then hopefully we should get a bit of time off over June, maybe.
So month of June's a quiet one?
Usually that's our quietest month is June, and then it ramps back up again for July, August for the spring calving. We'll do it all again. We've
got less hours of daylight now as well, which is makes it hard.
It really, doesn't it? It just makes it so much harder to get anything done outside of work hours. Every year you get caught out by it and you think, I'm more organised or whatever next year, but it just is one of those things. Yeah,
I do enjoy the wood fire crackling away at the night time though.
Yeah, I got my heater cleaned the other day actually, so all on that front, so
Very good. Jim Carner. You were off to Jim Carner last weekend that we're talking to you.
Yeah.
What happened there?
No, that was a lovely little day out. So I went up the night before and just camped at the Buck and Pony Club grounds, and just took one young horse, and it was great. I caught up with a few clients at the pub the night before, so that's always nice. And he jumped around.
Did that
really
affect
nicely.
your performance the next morning?
No, it didn't sleep particularly well the night before, but I don't think that was the beers at the pub. The horse I took with me is really naughty, and it likes to pick its still yard up through the night and try and shift it around just to get an extra slither of green feed if he can drag his yard around. That wasn't ideal, and then I come out the next morning, and because he was yarded next to the tack box in the truck, he thought it'd be fun to open the door and pull the gear out and scatter it across the back of the truck. So I was not very impressed about that, but he thought it was funny. So
you don't use electric fences then? You got steel yards?
No, they're very sturdy steel yards. No, I don't use electric tape, but he likes to just pick it up in his mouth and just, I think, rub it around just to annoy me. I don't know. He's just a funny horse like that. But
how do you discipline a horse if he's doing something wrong?
It's hard because I'd get up through the night, and I actually wasn't even... At a previous event, I wasn't sure which horse was doing it, because you get up in the middle of the night and they'd all just stare at you innocently as if nothing was happening. It's nothing you can do. You just got to live with it.
No, good. And who took home the chocolates for the Jim Carner?
He won a couple of ribbons, which is nice. And so that was good. Top up the drinking glass stash, because they give you a cup for
all the
mismatched
place, in cups.
So most of my cups in my house have come from pony club events over the years. So
There are a fair few registrations up there.
Yeah, it was really good. There was plenty there, and it's nice to see the town well supported.
Yep. And you didn't make it to the rodeo the next day?
No, because it was the day before. I behaved myself and did some fences.
You did the boring stuff. Like you said,
did all the boring stuff. Yeah.
Now, last time we were in, a couple of things we just need to touch on. I asked a question about fence wire, the growth on that, if it's the same thing as Paspalum staggers, the black fuzz on that. And I did some Googling, and apparently it's not. So anyone that's listening that was wondering, it's actually just a harmless mould or algae that grows on it. So that's nothing to do with the same thing. But how are we going with Paspalum staggers? Are we still seeing a bit around?
Yeah, we're still seeing heaps. And the interesting thing is that we're now starting to see it in those younger autumn calves as they're making that transition from being obligate monogastrics that are drinking off their mothers, and they're now exploring different pasture species in their paddocks, and we're starting to see it in calves as well. So, yeah, the danger period is very much still upon us. So, yeah, we're now seeing it in calves as young as 8 to 9 weeks of age, just because they're starting to experiment with different forage options. And like I said last time, because the fungus that grows on the paspalum can be quite palatable, if they have it a few times and they think, oh, this tastes quite good.
You were saying that they get a bit of a taste.
Yeah, they can tend to develop a bit of a liking for it, and calves, only being little, obviously require less of a dose than an adult cow as well. Yeah, unfortunately the treatment is still the same, just to get them off that affected paddock and try and get them into a paddock with no paspalum, which I know for a lot of people at the moment is extremely challenging, because it's just been a really good season for it for some reason.
Does top-in paddocks help at all, do you know?
I reckon it would. I do often ask people if that's an option, and for some of them, because it's so steep, it's just not.
Yep.
But yeah, I think potentially making it that little bit harder for them to find it in the paddock, because it's the part of the plant that comes to the very top of the canopy. So even just to make it that bit harder for them to find and allow the other grasses to come up, I think could be beneficial. But I don't have any data to support that. But
yeah. I'll look out for the paspalum staggers as well, and basically they'll be staggering around the paddock. That's the first sign, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep, and moving them off those paddocks in a calm way is ideal. The other thing that we were talking about, which I questioned you and you doubted yourself, so sorry about that, you were right, is the facial eczema risk. You said on the north side is a higher risk, and I said, really? I thought it would have been the south side. And again, Dr. Gould came into it. The north side of a slope just warms up more, and so it provides a microclimate that's actually more conducive to grow those spores, whereas on the south side they often don't get the temperatures that they needed. So both get moisture, but the north side gets more warmth, and they need warm, humid conditions. Now, once again, trust Dr. Chelsea. Yeah.
Actually, on that note with facial eczema, I saw some cases in Orbost recently, and I spoke to Richard Shepherd about it, because we were discussing there's a lot of data on lifetime productivity in sheep, but to my knowledge not so much on dairy calves. So I gave him a call, and he said, just for anyone in Orbost I guess who's listening, that he regarded Orbost as a really specific microclimate that's very distinct from the MID, and he said they're regarded as the canaries in the coal mine for the whole wider region.
For East Gippsland sort of
Yeah, because of Orbost having a very unique climate compared to other parts of the region. He was saying that even he's heard of severe outbreaks where if a trough leaks and overflows into a paddock, that can sometimes be enough to cause a massive uprise of spores in that particular affected part. So, yeah, particularly in Orbost, there does seem to be some unique challenges there with managing it as well.
Yeah. So did you say that there are some cases?
Yeah, I saw some the other day. They weren't acute cases. They'd happened a few weeks prior, and they were on the resolving end of it, and I was out that way for other unrelated reasons, so just stopped by to take a look at them and have a bit of a chat about it. And yeah, and it was with your cattle, it's a bit harder to know what the lifetime impact could be, but yeah, we come to the conclusion that, particularly being quite young stock, that we would put pressure on them from a reproductive efficiency sort of perspective, and anything that doesn't get pregnant they can move on, and theoretically we're hoping that putting that sort of pressure on them for performance that way will hopefully select for the animals the ones that have been severely affected. So
yeah. And from memory, what was the critical temperature?
I think it was I want to say 18 degrees, but I've been discussing a lot of environmental conditions.
No, we'll double check.
And I'm worried I'm getting mixed up with a different disease now. I'm fairly sure it was 18 degrees, but I'd have to double check it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that today is another 23-degree day, so we're well above that even.
Yeah. And I remember this time last year we were still seeing cases of facial eczema in sheep through May as well. Yeah, with regards to facial eczema, particularly in sheep, I don't think we're out of the danger period yet either.
And we're probably... What are properties around the district? Are they starting to run out of feed now? Are they still growing plenty?
Yeah, certainly with the beef producers I've been speaking to, they're getting not severely concerned, but concerned enough that they're planning ahead with feed budgets and things like that, and looking at stock that they can offload in the foreseeable future. We're certainly doing a lot better than other parts of the state, but there is still a bit of concern about that people are starting to run out of feed, and we just haven't had much of an autumn break yet to see us through to the other side of winter, which is the concern.
Yeah, that was the other thing that you mentioned, that as feed gets a bit shorter, they can ingest more of those spores. So.
Yeah, certainly. And more so a problem with sheep than cattle, but yeah, certainly is still a problem.
Okay, now the topic that you want to talk about today, I wouldn't say it's broad, but it's prolapses. There's a bunch of different types of prolapses we can see in the livestock. Do you want to just give a quick rundown on what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, very broadly, a prolapse is essentially just an internal organ that has come to the outside of the body for whatever reasons. The three main prolapses we see in both sheep and cattle are the rectal prolapses, and then vaginal prolapses and uterine prolapses. And we've seen all of them over recent months, and all have got very different causes and treatments as well.
All right, let's go one by one, I guess. Top of my list is uterine prolapse, often in dairy cattle.
Yeah, quite often in dairy cattle, but also in older sheep and beef cattle as well. So the uterine prolapses usually almost always occur immediately after calving or lambing.
In a difficult calving or lambing, or can it just be a...
Usually with your beef breeds and sheep, there is some degree of dystocia that's impacted that outcome. With particularly older breeds of older beef cattle and dairy cows, particularly high-producing dairy cows, sometimes a very mild milk fever or hypocalcemia can precipitate a uterine prolapse as well. So calcium is very important for normal muscle function, and the uterus is surrounded by smooth muscles. So if we don't have enough calcium for those muscles to contract properly, then we can definitely see uterine prolapses as a secondary consequence to that.
Just an animal that's in poorer condition,
Potentially.
Does that affect anything?
It can, just because there's a bit of a loss of muscular wall support, particularly around the pelvic floor. So yes, occasionally we can see it. And also just because I think those lower condition animals are just a bit weaker in general at the time of calving as well. They just become exhausted a lot quicker. So yeah, potentially I think there can be some issues, particularly with the dairy cattle again, that there's been some issues with transition management.
Yep. So talk us through what happens. We see uterine, like got a calf on the ground. What's next? And there's what is actually hanging out the back.
Yeah, so uterine prolapses are pretty spectacular sight to behold when they occur.
Spectacular for a vet or a normal person?
For nobody. For absolutely nobody. Because, yeah, it's the entire uterus that comes out. You'll often see those lumps on the surface of the uterus, which are the placentomes, which are responsible for the placental sites that supply the oxygen.
Yeah, because it's not a smooth. I always thought it was a smooth.
No,
yeah.
Everyone says it looks like an alien placenta because it's so lumpy looking. But that's called the placentomes, and they're the sites of nutrient transfer from cow to calf, and very unique to ruminants as a broader group of animals. And usually it's the whole uterus. What complicates...
And that's quite large too,
It
isn't it?
is, yeah. And what happens is once the uterus comes out, the venous return of blood flow can get a little bit occluded, so they swell up and become really edematous as well. Over time, they will grow in size. But also they can be complicated by the bladder coming out with them as well. And in really rare but very difficult cases to manage, you can get intestines trapped in the uterine prolapse as well. So that's obviously pretty dire, but it does occasionally happen.
Yeah, and so will that whole uterus come out in the one instance, or can we make it worse? It keeps coming, like more of it comes out.
Usually I find it's a bit of a slippery slope. Once part of it comes out, the whole thing comes out in pretty quick succession. So, yeah, it's to do with the fact that, once a small amount of it comes out, usually the cow starts pushing because it's uncomfortable, and it actually makes it a lot worse.
All right, so we spot that. What do we do? Call you, obviously, first.
Yeah. It's one of the most highest regard emergencies for any livestock vet.
Why is that?
Because they can be very rapidly fatal, and the best prognosis will be if we can attend them sooner rather than later. Just because the longer it's out, the more risk that uterus will sustain serious damage, and also just because over time it will start to swell, which is going to make it harder to put back in. But I've also attended cases where, particularly with really fractious and hostile animals, they'll thrash around and they'll quite literally swing the whole thing into a gateway as they're running through gates and things like that.
And quite a delicate
And it's
organ,
a very
aren't they?
delicate organ, and it's not meant to be outside the body. And there's a lot of very large blood vessels that are usually inside that prolapse as well. So once it starts to become traumatised, time is very much of the essence. And when we go out on farm to try and treat these animals, if the animal's down and sitting down comfortably, I try and get people to leave them in the paddock rather than trying to muster them, because as I said, if they get a bit stirred up and they smack it into a gateway, that can be enough to make the outcome substantially less favourable. So if they're sitting in the paddock, we try and just leave them there. If people feel comfortable, I'll often ask them to put a halter on them and try and restrain the head so that when we do attend the cow, it doesn't just get up and walk off as soon as we arrive. So if we can have them restrained but sitting down, that's the best case scenario. But occasionally what we can also do is sedate them in the paddock to make that whole process a bit more easier for the animal. Obviously that it's not a great scenario to be in, because sedating them comes with a risk of causing blood pressure problems as well. So it's not an easy problem to deal with just from a practical sense, that's for sure.
Yeah, so if they're calm enough to walk them in the yards, that's option number one.
Yeah, if they're settled and, they're on their feet when you find them, then, walking them very gently to the yards is the next best option.
Yeah. And then what's it look once you get there and they're restrained or sedated? What's the process?
So what I like to do in ideal circumstances is get the cow into what we call a frog leg position. So it's where we actually pull both back legs out behind the cow, so that when you're trying to put the prolapse back in, you can pick the whole thing up in your lap and feed it downwards. So you're using gravity to help you put it back in, because they're really big structures to have to put through a fairly small hole.
Yeah.
So it's a very physical job. So any way you can position the animal to make it easier for yourself is always really handy. The other thing that we'll do often as well, if there's a lot of edema and swelling, is pack the surface with sugar, because sugar, being what we call a really high osmotic force, it will attract the fluid component, also the water, out of that uterine wall, which can sometimes help to shrink it a little bit.
Yeah, so to reach an equilibrium, it'll
yeah,
basically draw
exactly.
out
It's that concept of equilibrium. So the water will be attracted to the high solute concentration of the salt, and it will travel towards the salt and thereby shrinking the surface.
You said salt. We had a discussion
sugar.
off.
Sorry.
Yeah, you said sugar originally, because I brought it up because I thought it was a wives' tale. You said no, it's a legitimate thing, and then you just touched on salt because at a last resort, you've used salt before as well.
Yeah, and I probably wouldn't do it again, but we had a very difficult one that just would not get back in, and we're in a very remote area and there was no sugar available, and it worked quite well, and that animal was anaesthetised anyways, so even though it would have stung, thankfully she didn't feel anything.
Yeah.
And we flushed it out of the uterus after we got it back in, and it did work, because in that particular instance we were in a real spot of bother and it was that or the cow was going to die. So we took that option and it worked quite well, but I'd always use sugar as a first option. Yeah,
so that's to physically shrink the overall size so it can be put back in. Now, you said it's quite a large structure. Is this a one-person job, or the producer's going to be helping in some regards as well?
Usually I end up putting the prolapse back in myself, but usually 1 to 2 people to help is quite helpful. Usually once I've got the cow in that prolapse, in that frog leg position, I'll get someone to sit on the cow's back to just stop them trying to get back up while we're trying to put it back in as well, because there's nothing worse than having it 80% of the way in and then the cow tries to get up and walk off on you. We'll try and get someone to sit on them just to discourage them from trying to get up while we're trying to put the uterus back in. But occasionally sometimes, because the hardest part is you've got to use your fist to put it back in, and the temptation is obviously you want to grip onto it with your fingers because it's slimy and slippery. It's not an easy surface to work with. So sometimes having an extra set of fists to push it back in can be quite useful as well, because it was one of the hardest jobs physically that we really get in this job.
And what's the overall time frame? Do you have a rough idea how long it's going to take you?
The ones that go really smoothly, I can get on and off farm in 45 minutes, but that's probably the exception, not the rule. That's with everything working in your favour. Yeah, it's usually around an hour and a half.
Yeah, gee. So it's no gym that day.
No, and there's a lot of post-op care once you get it back in to make sure that, because there's going to be some shock that you got to deal with often as well. We usually administer pain relief and antibiotics, and what I often do is I'll flush the uterus out once it's back in as well, because as much as you try and clean it before you replace it, it's almost impossible to have it back to the sterile environment that it should be. So usually we'll give it a nice warm flush with some saline solution to try and remove all the extra debris and things like that, and also get the sugar back out. And yeah, I find if you leave some clean water in at the end of it, it just helps to weigh it back down, because the other thing is that obviously we don't want them to re-prolapse it back out either.
So I was going to ask, actually, what's the likelihood of it coming back out again?
It's actually quite low. Yeah, it is. So if you re-avert it properly, so the one thing you've got to be very sure of is that you make sure that there's no pockets that are still inverted that could then, as they start contracting, end up pushing the whole thing back out again. So it's really important you make sure that it's completely averted to the way that it was before.
As in turn back in the
turn
right
back
way.
in, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll often fill it with some warm water to help just facilitate that as well, because it just weighs the uterus back down. And as the uterus contracts back up, that water will come back out all the time anyways. So it just helps also, because it's nice and warm, it helps to deal with the shock by putting some warm water inside the body as well.
No stitching or anything like that needed?
No. If they're going to re-prolapse, they'll do it in spite of a booner
Right.
stitch. So I used to when I was a new grad, but I find if they want to re-prolapse, they'll re-prolapse in spite of the stitch. And the potential is that then they're just going to destroy their vulva in the process of trying to re-prolapse as well. No, I don't anymore for uterine prolapses.
Yeah. All right. I'm exhausted already just to talk about this. You're right. What's the next one we're talking about?
So I think the next one was vaginal prolapses, wasn't
Okay.
it?
Yeah, we'll go vaginal prolapse. Now, I'm assuming before carving this one?
Usually, yes. Yep. A vaginal prolapse is a distinctly separate disease process. So usually we see it in heavily pregnant cattle and sheep. And what happens is that there's a lot of body weight inside the animal. So there's a lot of high abdominal pressure, and the vaginal wall gets a bit weakened, and so it starts to prolapse, particularly in late gestation. But occasionally we do see it in early gestation with cattle as well, but also in sheep and cattle that are on higher levels of estrogenic clovers as well, because estrogen causes softening of the vaginal tract. So it will
As in the dilation sort of effect?
Yeah, and it's because estrogen causes edema, so swelling, so it makes things a bit softer, which, it just means that they're more likely to prolapse as well.
Yeah, and we dealt with it a few years back with the sheep. There's actually some unusual practices to help.
Yeah.
Well, aids, I guess you would call them.
Yeah. With sheep, the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that tail docking below recommended lengths is also a bit of a risk factor as well, because if you tail dock too short where the vulva and the rectum aren't covered correctly, you can actually damage the nerves that are meant to close the rectum and the vaginal wall correctly. Yeah, correct tail docking.
The shearers would disagree with you there. They like a short tail, but
I'm
is
sure
it the
they
third?
do.
Is it the third knuckle?
Yeah, it's the third, and obviously you want the actual vulva covered as well to prevent vulval cancers and things as well.
Sun cancers and things.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so what do we do if we do have a vaginal prolapse?
Yeah, look, it's not as much of an emergency as the uterine prolapses are, but it's usually something we'll try and attend on the same day wherever possible, just because they can dry out and get quite necrotic and infected if we don't deal with them in a reasonably timely manner. So it's the same day sort of appointment level of urgency. And what we typically do, it really depends on what the farmer wants to do with the animal. If the cow or sheep is only a week off calving or lambing, we'll often just place a booner stitch under an epidural to stop it re-prolapsing. And
You have to explain a booner stitch to me.
A booner stitch is a thick piece of stitching material that we just do as a purse string around the vaginal tissue to close it up so they can't. So there's enough room for them to urinate through it, but it's enough to stop the prolapse from coming back out.
Yeah, and they won't carve or...
No, so that's the corollary of that, is that the producer has to be very eagle-eyed in making sure that they identify when those animals start calving or lambing and take the stitch out, because obviously if we don't, there can be quite adverse consequences to doing that.
So we don't have to take that stitch out hours before calving, just a day, days before?
Preferably at least a day, just to be on the safe side. So, yeah, once we see that they're really starting to spring up, we tell people to remove them.
Yep. Now, do you know about the little plastic sheep one? Have you ever used that?
I've never used them, but I have definitely seen them. So they harness type. And there's also harness type ones as well, but yes.
Well, they remind me of a picture of ovaries, actually.
Yeah.
And they actually sit inside, but they can lamb through them. They'll push them out.
I was going to say, because they're attached to the wool, aren't they? So
I'll tie it underneath their legs or something. And,
And it
actually sits, from memory, inside the vagina.
Yep.
And then when they push hard enough, it's just a bit of, imagine a spoon, a wooden spoon, but a plastic one.
Yep.
And it just bends out of the road. And we tried it once with zero success, but some people do use them quite regularly. Yeah.
The other thing we can do with cattle is there are prolapse kits that essentially toggle the vaginal wall to the hindquarter muscles. So it's something, again, that a vet has to administer because we need to have a good epidural on board for pain relief. But the toggle allows them to calve without having to do any removal. So the toggle stays in place against the vaginal wall and just basically anchors the vagina inside the body.
Yeah.
And I have placed them, and I know cows have calved uneventfully from feedback from producers. So that is certainly an option.
And that's just removed later on.
Yeah, that's right. But I think probably the important thing with vaginal prolapse is to be aware of is, unless there's like a very obvious feed-related issue with estrogenic clovers and things like that, because there is a bit of a heritable component, we often recommend culling as the first option wherever possible, unless, like I said, they're right at the point of calving. So if we're early to mid-gestation or empty, my preference would be not to retain that animal, because there is genetic components. And also, genetic components aside, that individual animal, when they do get pregnant, is more likely to just keep having it happen every single year. So they just become problematic animals to have on the property. Yeah.
So if it's heritable, is there breeding values that would say that some are more likely to, some breeds?
Not to my knowledge, no. There are certain breeds that seem to be overrepresented, which is where the heritability of it comes from. And I certainly know that, and I recommend this, and I know several other practitioners do recommend not keeping the daughters out of females that have prolapse problems as well. But the mode of heritability and the breeding values of them as such, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, I'll name and shame the breeds. What are the...
I love Herefords, but Herefords are one breed with our southern breeds of cattle, but there are also families of Brahmins that do tend to be overrepresented as well. In
is this
systems.
Just the vaginal prolapse or prolapse?
just vaginal. Yes.
Right. Vaginal with sheep and coughing.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yes, definitely. And that's another risk factor with sheep as well. We do see, particularly there's a very specific bacteria called Mycoplasma that can cause respiratory issues in sheep. It causes a chronic cough, and very common in intensively housed sheep, so lamb lotting type scenarios.
Yep.
And the chronic coughing can cause concurrent vaginal and rectal prolapses as well.
Both.
Yeah. Just because they forcefully cough with such high abdominal pressure that, over time they start to develop prolapses. And so, they're really difficult ones to sort of manage because, you need to put a purse string in them. But sometimes if they're really severe, you do sometimes need to consider euthanasia for those animals because they're just really hard you can't stop them coughing once they've got mycoplasma a lot of the time.
So that mycoplasma, what is there some husbandry things we can do to reduce that, or is it just something that's always present?
There does tend to be herds that are positive to it and herds that are not. And I actually looked up this recently for a farm that we found it on, and even though most farms that we find it on do pretty much do everything right, trying to minimise dust and too much excessive commingling, cleaning water troughs and things like that can help. But on positive farms, even despite all those efforts, it can be a very frustrating disease to manage.
And is it contagious, or is it
it is. Yeah, but that's part of the problem, is that when we've got animals sort of housed intensively, it just transmits from one to another, particularly in water troughs and things like that, very readily. And because they're all drinking out of communal troughs, it can make it really hard to stop the spread once they're in that.
Yep. So will the animals build up some sort of a natural immunity, or will they come good, or is it just something that if that mob has been exposed to it, if you can cull it out?
Yeah, usually once the mob's been exposed, there is a very chronic cough, and if you give them enough time, eventually they will clear it, but it can be months of chronic coughing.
Yeah.
So typically when they're in those feet, unless they're using containment, if they're in there to be finished anyways, usually they finish with no major dramas, and often they have good average daily gains in spite of having it. So you just finish them and give the lot a really good clean afterwards and hope you don't get it in the next one.
I was actually thinking of, you just mentioned it there, containing ewes. Like if that comes up in your ewe flock, you're not going to go and cull your whole
That's
ewe maze.
right, and that's the challenge, because we researched that recently for that specific type of problem. What do you do when the breeding animals get it? And yeah, it's obviously not practical to cull the whole flock.
Yeah.
For some people it is something they do just have to live with, unfortunately, and the problem is that they can get better and then they go through a stressful event and it can recrudesce and things like that as well. So it's a bit of a frustrating one, and it's thankfully not very common. It's a frustrating disease more than anything. It doesn't cause massive amounts of death. It's just the constant coughing noise can be really draining for people to have to listen to all day.
Yeah. Rectal, we're up to our last form, rectal prolapses. We mentioned a little bit with the coughing. Is there other forms or other times that they'll get a rectal prolapse?
Yeah, so often with rectal prolapses there's some sort of chronic rectal irritation that precipitates the rectal prolapse. Quite often a chronic diarrhea will cause that, and the most common causes of those in sheep are parasites, and in cattle coccidiosis, which is also a parasite but a single-celled parasite. Again, a sort of disease where if we see one, it's a same day type appointment or at the nearest convenience, because again, we don't want it to dry out and get necrotic and infected. So yeah, it's usually something we'll try and attend to on the same day.
Yeah, so if it is often caused by diarrhea or the coccidiosis, that's a management thing that we can be on top of early?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously with sheep, doing prophylactic worm egg counts and drenching during high-risk periods, and coccidiosis with cattle can be very sporadic, and yeah, it's sometimes it shows up on some farms but not others, even though it's quite endemic. And coccidia, for some reason, sometimes we just get one or two animals that get it, but not the rest of the mob as well. So it can be very sporadic with coccidia.
Well, it seems to be the least of our worries, that sort of a prolapse. Now, you mentioned about the large blood vessels under tension. What's the biggest risk factor for that?
Yeah, that's right. So that's what makes a uterine prolapse so dangerous for an animal compared to a rectal or vaginal prolapse, is the fact that there's large blood vessels that are sitting in that prolapse that could become traumatised and can rupture very quickly.
And hence there's the swelling up of that uterus as well,
so
outside.
It impacts the return of blood from that uterus as well. So when it starts to get occluded, the uterus will start to swell because the blood supply is still coming in but it's not going out. Yeah,
so we'll just go through the three different prolapses and very quickly the differences and I guess management for those three different ones.
Yeah, so the standout one is probably your uterine prolapse, which is an immediate medical emergency. We're going to have the entire uterus external to the animal, and that requires a very rapid veterinary consultation to save that animal's life. Otherwise, we're at high risk of losing it.
Yeah, and that'll be extremely large after birth.
Correct, after calving, after lambing.
Yep.
That's right. And then you've got your rectal prolapses, which can obviously occur in both male and female animals, and usually accompanied by some sort of diarrhea. And then you've got your vaginal prolapses, which are usually prior to calving or lambing, and they're at their biggest about the size of a football, and you'll see a lot of straining and discomfort as well. But the rectal and vaginal ones consult a vet to have on the same day, but not necessarily at 2 a.m. or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not quite as urgent. And we've seen sheep that we've put them back in numerous times and They've survived for months. They've reared a lamb, actually.
Yeah.
Which is quite incredible.
Yeah.
And then other times they'll just die for no reason. But now, a couple of things have come to my mind. I was talking to a producer up in the Buchan area, and he had problems with fat sheep one year. Have you noticed sometimes it's also overly fat animals that have different types of prolapses?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a little bit to do with just a weakening of the vaginal wall as well. And it just, because there's increased body fat reserves inside the abdomen, that puts the pressure of the abdominal cavity to go up as well. So there's just more abdominal pressure to force internal organs outwards. Yes. The other thing is being in Buchan hill country can be
that was
a bit
my
of a
next
risk
one
factor.
actually. More over the Tambo, but hills.
Yes, just because they have to walk uphill. When I don't know what it's like for you walking up hills, Al, but I find my core strength is working a lot harder to just physically drive yourself up the hill.
Yeah.
There is more abdominal pressure being exerted when they're walking uphill. So yeah, just to maintain that core stability.
So something as simply, if you are having a few issues, if you could find some flatter paddocks.
Yeah, that could definitely help.
Relieve that for the month.
And get a bit of excess condition off if you're able to do that without obviously starving them right before lambing as well.
It's a pretty heavy topic. Actually, I was telling you a story off air. I got a phone call from a friend to help pull a calf. The calf was dead, and then it was a uterine prolapse as well, and then the cow died. After about an hour and a half or 2 hours, we put it down because she was going to die. But it was a long time for a very ordinary result. How does it affect you guys when you get a call up for a prolapse?
Yeah, it's right up there with one of the biggest kick in the guts you can get in this job, to be honest, because they're just so mentally and physically draining as well. Because what often happens and what often plays out is you really have to fight and argue with the animal to get them in the position that you need them to be to put the prolapse back in to begin with. So even just getting them in the right position is part of the hardest battle to begin with. And then, you go to all that effort of putting sugar on it and trying to squeeze it down to put it back in. And then what often happens is that those blood vessels, like we were talking about, if there's any minor tears or anything in them, sometimes you just don't know until you basically relax them and have the uterus back in. And I've lost count of the number of times that we've spent over an hour trying to get the prolapse back in, and you get the prolapse back in and the cow lives for all of 15 minutes and then drops dead in front of you. It is soul crushing at times, and we have a lot of conditions in veterinary medicine that play out like that at times. And I remember my old boss said, he's go, you got to be in it to win it. And I find over my career, I reckon it's a 50-50 chance, and there's been times where I thought it was better than that, and then there's been times where I thought it was lower. Over the 7 years I've been doing this, I've now I quote 50-50 as a ballpark, because some people aren't willing to spend the money to take that sort of chance, and that's fine. If prompt euthanasia is the path someone goes down, I'm not going to necessarily judge that, but it's a hard thing to deal with. It's just really hard. That's all I can really say. Yeah.
Oh, we appreciate you, Chelsea, and appreciate the work you do at all hours of the night and all conditions. So for a 50-50 chance, you would never turn one away. I know that for sure.
No, and I've never not gotten one back in unless it died prior to me getting the chance to do. But the other thing is that infection's a big complicating factor as well. So I generally say once we get it back in, if it survives 24 hours, that means we've beaten the blood loss. We've beaten the blood loss factor, but then we've got the infection factor to contend with as well. So I don't say they're out of the woods until they survive for 3 days.
Yeah, like I said, we appreciate it, and it's not something that everyone could do for sure, both physically and mentally. That concludes this session, but we've actually got your interesting fact, or not interesting fact, but something you have learnt that has surprised you. What can you share this month? We've had good response so far to yours, so don't let us down here, Charles.
I was actually at a discussion group, and one of the producers in our discussion group, and I can't even remember what precipitated the conversation, but it was to do with usage of pest spray type factors and how we can mitigate usage of glyphosate and things like that in farming to minimise our usage. And someone quoted that across Australia, there's 40% of ryegrass species are now demonstrating resistance to glyphosate in cropping farms, which is, when you hear something like that, it's quite scary to think about. I don't know what we can do with that information really, but it's a bit of a worry when we hear, and things like resistance in drenches and everything as well. It's going to put a lot of pressure, I think, on farmers in the future.
Yeah, I know in New Zealand they're really at new sort of modes of action, not just chemical now with drench resistance in sheep, but I hadn't heard about the ryegrass one being so high. We actually looked up some facts beforehand, and New South Wales, we're reading here, is 79% of ryegrass sampled in 2020 had resistance to glyphosate, so nearly 80%, which is staggering. In Western Australia, glyphosate resistance increased from 8% in 21 to 39% in 24. So in, 3 years is a fairly steep increase. So look out. They're trying to ban it in different parts of the world, aren't they, glyphosate?
Quite possibly. It's not a side of agriculture I honestly have a lot to do with, apart from occasionally with pasture establishment for the cattle themselves. But yeah, it's scary when it's not even working in large parts of the districts as well.
No,
so, yeah.
poor old ryegrass. I desperately try and grow ryegrass at my place, so I should talk to those croppers, see how they're doing such a good job. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Chelsea.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next month.
Great.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.